Well, as you may know, rapper 50 Cent has been teasing a documentary about his purported rival, Sean Diddy Combs, for more than a year. But now the 4-part docuseries has finally premiered on Netflix. The series explores Combs' life, from his upbringing, the creation of Bad Boy Entertainment, to all of the allegations of assault and sexual abuse since the 1990s. And it also investigates his alleged connection to the deaths of iconic rappers Biggie.
And the moment it happened, everything shifted. You could feel it instantly, like the ground moving under your feet just before an earthquake. What once seemed chaotic snapped into sharp focus, revealing the gravity of the situation and the irreversible consequences that were about to unfold.
After he was convicted on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution during his very high-profile federal trial earlier this year. The jury acquitted him of the top charges in the indictment, conspiracy to engage in racketeering, as well as 2 counts of sex trafficking. Now, the allegations against Combs, they have dominated the headlines since November of 2023. That's when his ex, Cassandra Ventura Fine, filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the music mogul, claiming he abused her during their 10-year relationship. And since then, he's not only faced this criminal trial, but also dozens of civil lawsuits that were filed on behalf of alleged victims. And many of the lawsuits include claims of sexual misconduct and rape and more. But to be clear, Combs and his legal team, they have adamantly denied any and all accusations of wrongdoing. Since Combs' arrest at the Park Hyatt Hotel in Manhattan in September of 2024, there have been several documentaries that have been released about the rapper's rise to the top of the music industry. There have been shows about his trial, but one of the most anticipated retrospectives is from a reportedly years-long rival of Combs, rapper Curtis Jackson, better known as 50 Cent. He is the executive producer of this project, initially teasing it with the title Diddy Do It, but the series was retitled Sean Combs: The Reckoning. It was released on Netflix on December 2nd, and it has skyrocketed to the top of the charts. In fact, 50 Cent posted on his Instagram on Wednesday, #1 on Netflix. You know, if you really like this docuseries, I'll make more, LOL. Now, the documentary's director, Alexandra Stapleton, said in a statement to Billboard, quote, "This isn't just about the story of Sean Combs or the story of Cassie or the story of any of the victims or the allegations against him or the trial. Ultimately, this story is a mirror reflecting us as the public and what we are saying when we put our celebrities on such a high pedestal. I hope this documentary is a wake-up call for how we idolize people and to understand that everybody is a human being." Okay, but here's the thing. Just one day before the series was set to air, Combs' attorneys sent a cease and desist letter to the streaming giant, calling the documentary essentially a hit piece, demanding it be removed. Now we're going to take a closer look at that letter, the arguments that Combs' team is making for all of this to be taken down. But first, I want to talk about some of the biggest, maybe most shocking moments from the series, and then we'll get to the C&D letter. So to do all that, I want to welcome back on Elizabeth Vulai, legal counsel here at Law and Crime, who knows a thing or two about the inner workings of the media and when things are brought in. But you also watched the entire show. Elizabeth, it's good to see you. Thanks for taking the time. Now you watched all of it. What was your main takeaway from the series? As somebody who actively followed the Diddy criminal case, has been here on Sidebar talking about the case, talking about his civil cases that he's facing, what was your main takeaway?
Yeah, there were a couple of takeaways. I think it was a really sort of original documentary, well put together. There were 4 episodes, usually most of them around an hour long, so it's very thorough. I think the 2 key takeaways were, one, everybody's talking about access to this footage and where it came from. One of the things that I think Diddy had done was he had said he'd hired a videographer. He's someone who films himself, as we've come to know, for most of his career and life. So he had hired this videographer to kind of follow him through this process. I'm not sure if the thinking was, he thought that he might evade the charges and come out with his own documentary afterwards. But just the access of footage that we get, we hear him speaking to his legal team. It's very rare you get an insight into that because, again, that's usually covered under attorney-client privilege. So speaking to his legal team, kind of his own thoughts about what was going on, because also remember, at this point, we really hadn't heard Diddy talk much about this. He had issued an apology over that video of him and Cassandra Ventura in that hotel hallway months before, but he hadn't really given any interviews to the media. He hadn't spoken about it, probably on advice of his attorneys.
It took a terrifying turn, and everyone paying attention knew instantly that this wasn't just another wave of rumors. This was heavier, more deliberate, something designed to force a reaction. For months, the situation had been spiraling in slow motion, with accusations circling, stories overlapping, and whispers growing louder, yet nothing had landed with enough force to completely flip the narrative. Until now. When the latest bombshells dropped, they didn't just add fuel to the fire, they redirected the flames entirely. This wasn't noise, speculation, or entertainment. This was pressure, and that pressure is what began breaking everything. What made this moment different was the precision. Every word felt intentional, every detail calculated, not for shock value or attention, but placed exactly where it would cause the most impact. And that's what sent shockwaves through the entire situation, because suddenly the story was no longer about isolated incidents.
And Elizabeth Milner's voice, Queen Elizabeth, were both in the documentary, I think in like episode 4 when it was going into the trial or in his arrest. It was interesting. I'll talk more. I am curious about what you think of that footage, and we'll talk about how it factors into the cease and desist letter. First of all, no attorney-client privilege, because if he is actively, deliberately, knowingly recording that, the privilege, anything that he says to his attorney, that's waived, right?
Correct. So that was one of the first thoughts I had is, he's speaking to Mark Agnifilo, who's the lead attorney on his legal team. They're talking about, overall case strategy, the indictment that they expect to come down. My first thought was, we've never seen this before. This must be privileged. But again, you forget there's a videographer in the room. So when you think about attorney-client communications, yes, that's usually covered under privilege. But if you have a third party that you're inviting into those communications, that's not necessary, unless that person is an interpreter or maybe an accountant. If you have a videographer that's there not for legal reasons, you can make that argument that, the privilege is waived.
And by the way, that conversation, the actual context of it, it's something that we always were thinking was going on behind the scenes. There was a sense of frustration about how the media and social media was portraying Diddy and the narrative, and he was like, we're losing. And he was getting a bit combative with Mark Agnifilo about what was going on. And he's like, look, I did everything. You said I'm basically an ideal client, a star client. I did everything you want. I came to New York. And he was just waiting to see if he would be arrested and indicted. And that was a bit of tension there, which it's a rare behind the scenes glimpse of what those conversations and what those moments are between an accused and their defense attorney before the hammer drops.
Yes, very rare. And that's, I think, one of the things that struck me and what a lot of people are talking about. Again, you don't usually get a window into that. I think the push and pull was, in the conversation, Mark Agnifilo had said, look, an indictment hasn't been dropped yet. The indictment came down September 16th of last year. And Mark Agnifilo had said it's mid-September at that point. So I think the indictment was really just about to drop. So at that point, you have Diddy who, he said, look, I've come to New York. I've basically surrendered. His legal team is taking the position, you have to cooperate and kind of show that you're here ready to take this head on. But then Diddy's sort of saying, we need to get someone out there on the comms front, as somebody who's, in his words, has dealt with the dirty side of media and propaganda. So I think what Diddy was trying to say was, there's nothing to be done legally on the criminal front because no indictment had been dropped yet. But in the court of public opinion, it seemed like he wanted to take a more aggressive approach to put a certain message out there. And his attorney seemed to kind of think the opposite.
And just to be clear, so the documentary begins with this shot of Combs in his hotel room in New York. This is, I believe, just 6 days before his arrest last year. Turns out Combs had hired this videographer to film him while he's in New York. The documentary's producers got their hands on this footage, and he's talking on speakerphone with Mark Agnifilo, this high-powered attorney, who's, by the way, just one of several lawyers he would have on his multi-person legal team, and says that more needs to be done to help his public image, that it appeared to him like they were losing. And remember, again, this is before he was officially indicted and arrested. Now, apparently he knew it was coming. He'd been under investigation for months at this point. In his statement to NBC News, Combs' publicist, Judah Engelmeyer, said, quote, "The footage was created for an entirely different purpose under an arrangement that was never completed, and no rights were ever transferred to Netflix. A payment dispute between outside parties does not create permission for Netflix to use unlicensed private material. None of this footage came from Mr. Combs or his team, and its inclusion raises serious questions about how it was obtained and why Netflix chose to use it." Now, Elizabeth, we're going to talk more about what
has to anymore. It became about a pattern, a system, a long-running structure built on silence and power. And once people began to see that pattern, there was no unseeing it. The bombshells didn't scream. They didn't need to. They sat quietly, heavy and undeniable, forcing everyone to connect the dots for themselves. Timelines that never quite lined up suddenly snapped into place. Behavior that once seemed odd now looked intentional. Relationships that appeared random now felt strategic. That's when panic truly set in. Because when a scandal changes shape, it stops being manageable. Individual claims can be denied, single stories can be spun, but when the narrative becomes systemic, denial collapses. There's nothing left to argue against except reality itself. And that's exactly what's unfolding behind the scenes. Everything is scrambling. Silence has replaced confidence. Statements are delayed, rewritten, or abandoned altogether. The usual defenses no longer work because this time the public isn't reacting emotionally, they're reacting analytically.
Cease and desist letter, but what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, it's hard to say because there's still such a big question mark in the air because, Curtis Jackson, aka 50 Cent, is one of the executive producers on the series. Him, the director, Netflix in general, is not saying where they got this footage, only that it was obtained legally. Diddy's side is saying this is coming from a videographer I hired. I know we'll get into the cease and desist. One of the arguments they make is, this is subject to NDAs or agreements that the videographer had signed with Diddy because he was, employed by Diddy, and therefore the footage belongs to Diddy. That's the argument that they're making. So it's difficult to say because Netflix is not really saying how or where they got this footage from. One of the things that they did say was that it was sent to them legally. So, if you have the videographer sending the footage to them physically, that would be fine, but it does leave a question mark about where the legal rights are coming from. The only really avenue I see is if there's some way that the videographer had obtained a license for the footage, then the videographer would have the ability to take that license and then transfer the footage over to Netflix. But if the footage belongs to Diddy, then that's a little bit tough.
That's a good point. Okay, let's keep that in mind. We'll talk about that in a minute. I do want to talk about the content of the series. So the series featured interviews with many people who were at one point in Combs' inner circle. This includes Aubrey O'Day, who was a member of the girl group Danity Kane, which was created on Combs' MTV show Making the Band. She has since accused Combs of basically grooming her, firing her for refusing to give in to his alleged sexual advances. We have Albie Shore, singer, songwriter, former record executive, dated Kim Porter before she was in a relationship with Combs. There's Roger Bonds, one of Combs' apparent former bodyguards, who's gone on the record to say that he knew Combs was allegedly physically violent with his then-girlfriend, Cassie. At one point in his interview with the documentary's producers, he said of Combs, "When I first met him, I liked him as a person because I didn't know him." You have Kalina Harper, who was part of Combs' group Diddy Dirty Money, released a statement supporting him after the third member of that group, Dawn Richard, had filed a lawsuit against Combs. And in the documentary, Combs can be heard calling Harper to complain about the lawsuit, asking her to put out a statement. A former friend, business partner of Combs, who appears throughout the documentary, is Kirk Burroughs, the co-founder of Bad Boy Records. The two apparently worked very closely together for years. Burroughs served as the general manager, handling the rapidly growing company's funds. And according to Burroughs, when they started Bad Boy, Burroughs was given a 25% stake in the company, with the other 75% being in Combs' mother's name, Janice Combs' name. And we're going to get more into why Burroughs alleges it was set up that way in just a second. But according to Burroughs, Combs allegedly threatened him in 1996 with a baseball bat, forcing him to sign over his stake. So Burroughs apparently sued in 2003. The lawsuit was thrown out because too much time had passed since the alleged incident. And more recently, Burroughs sued Janice Combs for fraud, Combs himself for sexual harassment. This is according to a report from Cinemaholic. And those appear to be ongoing, by the way. Now, Burroughs claims that he was blacklisted from the entertainment industry, led to periods of homelessness. He's since re-entered the music industry, starting Pop Life Entertainment in 2018. This is also per Cinemaholic. So, Elizabeth, there's a lot here. But what did you make of the Burroughs part where he was proving this kind of relationship that he had, and that he was coerced into giving up his stake in what would become a multi-million-dollar company? I mean, I guess the allegation is basically that Diddy ruined his life.
Yeah, that was there are a lot of difficult moments in the documentary. I watched all 4 episodes as mentioned, and that was a tough one. And again, information that we hadn't really seen before in prior documentaries. So, this is someone who had co-founded Bad Boy Entertainment with him.
Of the spotlight. People aren't asking, is this true? Anymore. They're asking, how deep does this go? And that question is dangerous, because depth is where the real damage lives. The new revelations didn't accuse outright. They didn't have to. They exposed contradictions so obvious that even the most loyal defenders began to hesitate. They highlighted decisions that only make sense if something was being hidden. They pointed to moments where power wasn't used to create, but to control. And once control is exposed, it loses its grip. What's truly terrifying about this phase isn't what's been said, it's what it implies. The implications are far more devastating than any single allegation, because they suggest that the chaos everyone's been reacting to is just the surface layer of something much darker underneath. Something organized, something protected, something enabled. And now that protection is cracking, the reactions tell the real story. Sudden distance from longtime allies. Abrupt silence from voices that never used to shut up. Strategic disappearances. Meetings happening behind closed doors, out of the spotlight. These aren't signs of confidence. They're signs of containment. Because when the question shifts from, did this happen, to how much of this was allowed, the danger isn't one person falling. It's an entire ecosystem being exposed.
Kind of run along the theme that I think prosecutors were trying to push in the actual case was that in the prosecutor's view, this is somebody who will do anything to basically get what he wants. He doesn't really care what effects or damage that causes to other people. And it's in different ways, right? Whether it's in the context of alleged abuse, business disputes, alleged sexual assaults, things that have been alleged in the civil lawsuits against him. And I think with Burroughs, it was really, kind of seemed to strike that theme as well, because he's saying, he had forced me out of the stake of my company. He had to deal with things like homelessness. Well, in the 2000s and 2010s, Diddy was really prospering, music, business, fashion. And one of the things that he had said, what he alleged in the documentary, and again, this is an allegation from him, was that the name Bad Boy Entertainment, Combs's name was not really involved in that on the corporate side. And one of the things he's saying is the reason for that was to avoid having to pay any liability from, the devastating basketball game that had happened in the early 90s, where he was the subject of wrongful death lawsuits because of the multiple deaths that had occurred as a result of that basketball game that Diddy was behind organizing. So that was really, surprising to hear.
Yeah, that was a big allegation, because the families of the victims killed in that stampede. It was horrible. We're talking about December 28th, 1991. Combs, fellow rapper Heavy D, they hosted this charity basketball game. The game took place at the gymnasium of the City College of New York. And according to the New York Daily News, before the basketball game started, people who weren't let inside, they broke a window, swarmed toward the entrance of the gym, all went down a staircase. The doors at the bottom of those stairs opened towards the stairs, not towards the gym. So once a crowd got down there, they couldn't get the doors open and people started being crushed. 9 people died. Dozens of others were injured. And there were no criminal charges that were ever filed against anyone for the stampede, but multiple families and injured victims, they filed lawsuits. And that's just one part, right? So I actually wanted to get into this too. The docuseries devoted a lot of time to the killings of Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls and Combs' alleged connections to this, to both men, obviously knew both of them. So there have been accusations made in the past that Combs' involvement in the East Coast, West Coast rap feud of the 90s, there was more than just talk, that it could have involved things like hit orders. Now, to be clear, these are allegations. There's no evidence to suggest this. This series, though, it emphasizes that he has never been investigated or charged regarding their assassinations. Nevertheless, several interviewees during this documentary expressed that Combs' actions seem suspicious in hindsight. The documentary plays part of an interview that Dwayne "Keepy D" Davis did with investigators looking into Tupac's murder, which had become a cold case. And on the tapes, Keepy D says that Combs agreed to pay him if he killed Tupac and also rival record label head Suge Knight. Now, Davis allegedly admitted that his nephew Orlando Anderson was the one who shot the men, killing Tupac, injuring Knight. But Davis says Combs never came through with any payment. And by the way, Davis is currently awaiting trial for Tupac's murder in Las Vegas. Combs has always denied any involvement in the assassination. That was a big moment, I would say. Elizabeth, that was a big part of this. I didn't know that was going to be a part of this documentary.
I was really surprised as well. So I believe it's the second episode that dedicates a lot of time to it. And like you said, there have been insinuations in the past. They played video clips of, Sean Combs being asked in prior interviews in the 90s and 2000s, do you know, who killed these men? Did you have any involvement? He's always denied it, to be clear. These are just allegations. But yeah, that was really, really shocking. And one of the sort of a little bit more of the backstory behind
Involvement, complicity, silence. benefit? Those are the questions that start surfacing once clarity sets in. And they don't just point in one direction, they radiate outward, touching everyone who stood close enough to see, hear, or know something and chose not to intervene. That's why this phase is so volatile. It's no longer about defending against accusations. It's about defending past choices. Who stayed quiet, who looked away, who signed off, who kept cashing checks. When clarity arrives, neutrality disappears. You're either part of the explanation or part of the problem. And this is where the real unraveling begins. Not with headlines, not with court dates, but with fractures in loyalty. People reassessing old alliances, old statements being scrubbed, old friendships suddenly rebranded as professional distance. Because once a structure built on silence is exposed, everyone has to decide whether they were inside it or trapped by it. What makes this moment irreversible is that it can't be spun back into confusion. Chaos can be managed. Confusion can be exploited. But clarity? Clarity sticks. It sharpens memory. It connects dots retroactively. It turns coincidence into pattern and isolated into systemic. And once the public sees a system, the conversation never returns to where it started. The questions don't stop. They multiply. They deepen. They follow money, power, access, and influence. And no amount of silence can drown that out anymore. Because the story has crossed the line where control was possible. From here on out, it doesn't matter who speaks first or loudest. The narrative is moving on its own, and everyone caught in its path knows it.
With Tupac was that a lot of the interviewees in the documentary were saying that Biggie, who was signed with Bad Boy and who's really close with Diddy at the time, was starting to form a friendship with Tupac, and they were getting really close. And a lot of the interviewees were saying, in their view, Diddy didn't really appreciate that. So I think that a lot of the themes that you see again is coming up as him sort of wanting and needing to be the number one person in people's lives, whether it was personal, business. And it's really interesting because you see a lot of the themes that, again, the prosecution was trying to push forward that we saw in his personal life with Cassandra Ventura, always needing to be number one, not necessarily regarding the damages he's doing to other people in the prosecution's eyes, right? Playing out in the business sense. So the backstory is that he didn't appreciate the friendship that was forming between Biggie and Tupac, and therefore, that's where his alleged involvement came in. And then when, in terms of the non-payment, I think that was also a really shocking moment as well, because that's something we saw happening over and over in the documentary. Multiple people who were saying, I was cheated out of my share in the company. I wasn't paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And allegedly, that's sort of how he treated the artists that were on his label. So again, it's the theme of always wanting to be number one and, not necessarily giving people their due, business sense or perfect personal sense.
Okay, so with that, I will tell you, I think one of the most shocking allegations comes to Biggie Smalls, okay? You talk about finances, you talk about, okay, one of the biggest names at Bad Boy, seemingly very close friends with Sean Combs. Well, according to Kirk Burrows, Combs, and again, this is his allegation, according to Kirk Burrows, Combs insisted that Biggie travel to Los Angeles as part of an album tour, and this is despite, the serious dangers that were present from the rivalries, the East Coast, West Coast. And once there, Combs allegedly decided to cancel a trip that Biggie was supposed to take to the UK, instead saying he needed to stay in LA. Combs apparently threw a large party, and after which, someone opened fire on the car that Biggie was riding in, killing him. Now, Burrows alleges that Combs used all of this publicity around Biggie's murder and his massive funeral to just gain his own fame for his own benefit, shooting to the top of the charts with the song Missing You, which featured, by the way, Biggie's widow. But this was one salacious claim that I really wasn't expecting. According to Burrows, Combs, allegedly, charged the costs of that massive funeral to Biggie's estate and had Biggie's recently renegotiated contract changed to make it more favorable for Bad Boy Records and less favorable for Biggie's loved ones after his death. Elizabeth, again, that one I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, it was really unexpected. And again, I think it speaks to the strength of the documentary, just at least creatively and what they were able to get in terms of the interviewees, claims that we hadn't heard before. So the claims were that, he had wanted, in the documentary, the interviews talk about, Diddy had said, we need to put on the biggest funeral New York has ever seen for Biggie. And when apparently, allegedly, when he saw how much it would cost, that's when he had said, we'll be charging this to the estate, allegedly. One of the other things was he had wanted to put out that song about Biggie Biggie after he had passed away, and that was really a big moment. He had performed it at the MTV Movie Awards. And then one of the other claims was, Biggie was set to debut on the cover of Rolling Stone, or at least be on the cover of Rolling Stone. And allegedly, one of the interviewees says after he had passed, Sean Combs had called him and said, "I'm coming out with my first solo album. I need that cover." So Sean Combs had allegedly taken that cover from Biggie even after he had passed away. And again, it kind of rides to this theme of, in the public, his friend had passed away. He was devastated. But sort of what you see behind the scenes, at least what the documentary is alleging, is all the different ways he's using that to help benefit him financially and in terms of his career, which is something that we hadn't seen before. And, even myself, like I'm sure you empathize, Jesse, as a millennial. We grew up seeing Diddy, knowing the backstory of him and Biggie, and sort of knowing that song and thinking, oh, they were close friends. He paid tribute to.
Because once duration enters the conversation, everything tightens. Time is unforgiving. Time exposes discipline, repetition, planning. Time turns impulse into practice and practice into culture. And culture is where responsibility stops being individual and starts becoming shared. That's why this phase feels different. The question is no longer what happened, but how was this sustained?
Who normalized it?
Who benefited from it? Who protected it? Systems don't survive on one person's will alone. They survive on cooperation, convenience, and fear. And when people start tracing that ecosystem, the blast radius expands far beyond the original center. What's especially unsettling is that the revelations don't feel rushed. They feel paced, like someone understands timing, like restraint is being used strategically. That alone sends a message. This isn't desperation, it's leverage. And leverage is terrifying because it means whoever holds it doesn't need to speak loudly, they just need to wait. You can see the shift everywhere. In the way conversations suddenly stop mid-sentence. In how once confident voices hedge their language. In how people emphasize distance instead of denial. That's not outrage. That's calculation. That's people realizing the past may be reinterpreted through a lens they can't control. And here's the part no one wants to say out loud yet. When a narrative reaches this stage, it stops belonging to the original players entirely. It becomes a case study, a warning, a reference point. Future stories will point back to this one and say, this is what it looks like when power goes unchecked long enough to mistake itself for immunity. That's why this isn't fading. It's settling. And once a story settles, it doesn't disappear, it hardens. Into record. Into memory, into consequence. The danger now isn't exposure. It's accumulation. Because every new detail doesn't just add information, it confirms structure. And structure, once seen, can never be unseen.
Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California. 2 of the 3 locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argue. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. In the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, They will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects.
It wasn't emotional or sensational, and that's what made it so devastating. It didn't beg for belief or demand outrage. It simply laid out facts in a way that forced people to connect the dots themselves, and once people reach conclusions on their own, they defend them far more fiercely than anything they're told. That's when the panic began, not publicly but behind closed doors, where movement slowed, voices went quiet, and confidence evaporated, because loud denial now only raised more questions than it answered. And the most disturbing part wasn't what was said, but what suddenly made sense. As moments once brushed off as uncomfortable became intentional, decisions once labeled reckless revealed calculation, and relationships that seemed accidental now looked engineered, shifting the story from chaos to design. And design implies awareness, choice, and control. Control that is now slipping away, leaving behind a fallout that isn't loud yet, but is everywhere, visible in the distance people create, audible in the silence where certainty once lived, and palpable in the hesitation infecting every move, because this is no longer strategy but damage control with no options left. The conversation no longer about isolated incidents, but about systems that protected behavior and influence that buried truth for years until someone stopped playing nice. And once that door opens, it never closes, making power react unpredictably, mistakes inevitable, slips unavoidable. Each one another crack in an already shattered foundation. As the audience notices the fear, the silence growing louder, the swagger replaced by hesitation, and with that fear visible, the illusion of control vanishes entirely, marking a point of no return where there is no clean ending or redemption arc, only fallout that spares no one connected to it. As whispers become something unstoppable and the story locks itself onto a path it cannot escape, driven by a truth that no longer needs volume, because it has momentum, and momentum doesn't care who it crushes.